Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast, your go-to hub to learn insights and the latest developments in the wild and wonderful world of Web3. I'm Alec Burns.
And I'm Jack Davis. Tune in each week as we navigate and explore the rapidly emerging landscape of the Web3 technologies, projects, and ideas that are shaping the future of the internet.
We'll be talking to the best and brightest in the industry to keep uncovering insights,
so that hopefully we can all learn together on our journey to untangle Web3.
Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Hey, Jack, how are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thanks. How are you, Alec?
Yeah, not too bad. I think I'm still riding the high of last week's episode, so I'm very excited for this.
Yeah, exactly. You know, most podcasts don't make it past episode 1, so this is exciting to be here to do the second.
Yeah, it was a big first episode as well. I think we covered a lot, and I think we realized how many gaps we have in our knowledge and how big this is going to be.
Yeah, it's one of those, you know, it's a difficult balance between trying to cover something at high level and generically and give an overall picture. But, you know, that we introduce so many concepts that we'll definitely need entire episodes on in the future. So don't worry if you listen to the first one and we're thinking, you know, what are we talking about at some points? Because we will definitely expand on everything in the future, I think.
Yeah, so we didn't actually realize this was going to be a thing, but we obviously referenced my mom quite a bit in the last episode. So I had to show her the episode and she loved it. I mean, she loves everything I do. So I don't know if she's a very fair kind of judge of everything. But one of her biggest questions was, okay, I kind of understand what Web3 is. What is blockchain? What is this blockchain that you keep talking about? And I think that's quite an important thing. And it's going to be the core concept that we address in this week's episode. So I think, yeah, this week we're going to focus on blockchain, the history of blockchain, some of the major use cases of blockchain, and the core concepts of blockchain.
Yeah, that's the next question logically, right? It's that we said these two things, Web3 and blockchain, are inexorably linked to one another, but we haven't really defined blockchain yet in any meaningful terms. So why don't we start there? Well, what is the definition of blockchain? Maybe if you want to go first, Alec, give us a nice layman's concise definition of blockchain for us.
This is becoming a habit where I go first every time while you've got time to work out your answer.
It's becoming clear who the layman is, by the way.
So. Yeah, so I am well versed in trying to make things digestible. My definition of blockchain would be it's effectively a digital record of transactions that are shared and maintained by multiple computers, and this, along with some kind of quite detailed mathematics, cryptography, make it very secure and very difficult to edit, and that's kind of the core concept of blockchain. Jack?
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. I think because we mentioned digital ledgers, right? So really, a blockchain is just a digital version of something we have many examples of in the real life, in the historical world, of these idea of ledgers. So a ledger is just somewhere you're recording information. Transactional ledgers is a classic one. Your bookkeepers, the books they're keeping are the ledgers themselves. And blockchain is really just a digital version of that. But there are kind of two aspects to what I think a blockchain is. One is the data structure itself. So that's not necessarily the most interesting part, actually. The blockchain is just this chain of blocks, and each block is like a page in my ledger. So it's just an aggregation of, say, the last month of transactions I've done or we've done collectively. And that structure, that's not in and of itself that interesting. You can kind of recreate a blockchain like that in an Excel spreadsheet. Have one sheet for this month, the next sheet for the next month, and then they get linked together using this cryptography that Alec mentioned. The kind of more interesting aspect of blockchain that we're talking about and why this has become a buzzword is the fact that it's distributed. So it's a distributed ledger, not just digital. And that means it's shared and replicated amongst a network of different computers. So it's available. People can make sure it's consistent and everyone's checking everything on the ledger.
Yeah, I did think we said concise, but
well, you have to give some detail, right?
No, that was great. That was super informative. I think maybe the next thing would actually be to go into the history of blockchain. Obviously, you say it's kind of come into the public limelight in the last few years with all these kind of crypto scandals and Ponzi schemes and kind of speculative kind of money hikes. Maybe it'd be good to go into some of the background about where blockchain originated and how it's evolved over the years.
Yeah, sure. I agree. So what popularized blockchain is the advent of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, the white paper came out in 2008, and then the first, the actual network itself started in January 2009. And that was the first kind of accepted or widely used, and now it's widely used, application of this blockchain structure and this idea of a distributed database or ledger that's maintained by an open group of our participants. So Bitcoin is really the thing that kicked everything off and started the conversation about blockchain. And then a little bit further down the line, that then evolves and becomes this whole blockchain industry that we're now talking about.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting facts that I like about Bitcoin is obviously we have these blocks that are mined. And something that I quite like is that there was this encrypted message in the Genesis block, the first ever block of Bitcoin. And the encrypted message read, it was the Times title said, "Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." And there was kind of like 2 points to that. There was a reference to some of the early work of blockchain technology. There was actually before it was kind of, I guess, moved to computers, where there were some projects around using newspapers to link events together, and also around this alternative to peer-to-peer electronic cash system, which maybe would improve the efficiencies of banks. So I quite like that.
Although I think you put your foot in it with your layman's description, because you said the message was encrypted, and actually it may have been cryptic, but it wasn't actually encrypted. So the message itself, and this is one of those kind of things you still hear repeated a lot, is people think these blockchains, these distributed ledgers, are encrypted because we use this word crypto to talk about the assets sometimes. But actually, Bitcoin is an example of a blockchain where all the data is public, and that's part of why they're so powerful. You can trace the movement of funds. You can see exactly what's going on. There's no encryption of and encryption, by the way, maybe we should just explain, is when you have a message. So you might have a transaction that says Alec pays me for some service, and we can either encrypt that so no one can see. Someone can see there's a record on the blockchain, but no one can see what's happened. But on Bitcoin, actually, the opposite is true. You can always see there's a motion of funds from one party to another. So that's one of the key distinctions of Bitcoin to some of the other blockchains we see.
Yeah, and I guess we're definitely going to spend future episodes going into the difference between encryption and hashing. And hashing, obviously, a core concept of blockchain generally. So to correct, it was a hash that was on chain, right? Not an encrypted message.
Nearly. The message itself was still plain text. So
was it?
If you go down, exactly. If you go and download Block Zero or go to a block explorer online and just search Bitcoin Block Zero, this message was just inscribed directly in plain text in the block as a kind of timestamp of when it originated. So some people think the idea of this was it was a newspaper headline, as you said, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout of the banks. And the point being that it's like holding up a newspaper in a photo to show that this is happening on this date, or this couldn't happen before this date. So that kind of is a timestamp marker for the start of the Bitcoin blockchain.
Okay, well, that's a great analogy for maybe not trusting third parties all the time and sometimes self-verifying.
Yeah. So maybe it's worth then going on to, what happened after that. Was we're talking about 2009, things developed and grew into, now we talk about many, many thousands of blockchains that exist. So what was the kind of next phase in the evolution for you, Alec?
Yeah, so I mean, the next phase, okay, I guess most people are aware of Ethereum, second biggest blockchain by market cap, and that was invented by a man called, mainly by a man called Vitalik Buterin in 2015. It's actually really interesting why he got into blockchain. Do you know this, Jack? Why Vitalik got into blockchain?
I think I know part of it, but please remind me because I can't remember exactly.
So he was an avid World of Warcraft player, actually very good at it, and spent a lot of time on it. And one day his character got nerfed, which for the non-gamers out there means his character stats were reduced quite dramatically. And this basically like destroyed him. I think he described it as like a horror of centralized systems, and kind of this defined his character arc. And then all of a sudden he became an avid admirer of blockchains and decentralized networks. And that's one of the primary reasons he moved towards developing Ethereum. So if we think of Bitcoin as the first peer-to-peer electronic cash share system, then Ethereum hoped to be the first world computer. And it's
what do you mean by that? What do you mean by world computer there? What's the concept there?
So the idea effectively was to create a decentralized platform with a focus on the creation and execution of smart contracts. And smart contracts, kind of really briefly, we'll probably spend future episodes speaking in detail about smart contracts, self-executing contracts that are written in code effectively. And we kind of talked about it a little bit in the last episode around in Web3 versus Web2, the trust changing and getting more visibility in how things are done. And smart contracts can actually play a key role in that, even if there are some issues that arise from having like this kind of quite black and white or binary smart contracts kind of controlling how things are done.
Yeah, I think that's a nice description. I would add that if you think of Bitcoin as being a blockchain where we're recording simple transactions in the basic case between people like you and I, then and the nodes, the entities, let's say, who are in this network, this distributed network, who have copies of the blockchain, their role is to verify the new transactions, check that this payment is valid, and you're not trying to spend money. You're not trying to send me money that you've already sent to our producer Emma, in the background, and one of us is going to lose out. And in Ethereum's case, the network of nodes, what they're doing is they're not just verifying events that are happening; they're also collectively executing code, but essentially, so the network is executing these more complex functions. They're doing computation, which kind of takes it a step beyond simple payments.
So is Emma getting paid for this? I didn't realize we were getting paid for this.
Well, I don't think we deserve to be paid just yet. So
Emma definitely does deserve to be paid. She just said, "Lol, I wish." So yeah, I think so. This kind of rise in the smart contract focus of Ethereum meant there was lots of developers, lots of applications being built on top of the Ethereum network. I think one of the biggest ones that some of us are aware of would be CryptoKitties. I know, Jack, you're an avid player of CryptoKitties back in the day. It was basically a way of collecting these kind of, I guess, these token kitties that you could exchange and play games with. There was lots of upgrades along Ethereum. I think one of the most interesting ones, which relates to this smart contract, was around this decentralized autonomous organization hack, which I think was back in 2016, 2017. Jack, do you remember this?
Yeah, I wasn't around in the industry per se at the time, but it's one of those big events that everyone is kind of scarred with or remembers quite vividly. So yeah.
Yeah. So really, really briefly, there was basically this decentralized investment pool that was built on top of Ethereum, and they used smart contracts to govern it. And effectively, someone found a bug in these smart contracts, and they managed to siphon off 50 million back in the day of Ethereum off this smart contract. And this caused outrage in the community, and basically divided Ethereum, not down the middle, but into two major camps. One group who were like, okay, we can't allow this hack to go ahead. We need to, actually correct it and bring the coins back. And the other group who were like, I mean, this is blockchain's immutability. We shouldn't be changing these things. And there was this quite a philosophical debate, and it caused a split, or a fork, as we kind of call it in blockchains typically, between the protocols, where you had the Ethereum that most people know, the most widely used one, that brought the money back into the fold and kind of reversed the hack, and then Ethereum Classic, which maintained the kind of the hack. But this shows some of the issues that actually exist with smart contracts, like because they're definitive and they're so black and white, which doesn't always replicate what we see in the real world. These hacks can happen, especially when contracts are getting quite complicated.
Yeah, and you're going back to 2016 2017 there, which is, that seems like really the early frontier of the blockchain industry. So that there are lots of these kind of examples now of things going wrong, and the need for caution when looking at, and also you bringing up the DAO hack and the kind of split in the network that happened. That introduces this idea of why do we talk about this pluralism of blockchains? Why don't we just have one or two? And in its history, it's been partly new blockchains starting up to be kind of application specific. So for a certain use case, trying to do distributed file storage as a kind of utility token or something like that, or companies just trying to launch their own as a fundraising mechanism, which is another. And the third kind of avenue then is when you have one blockchain where many people agree on what should be happening, and there's kind of a broad consensus on how it should work. And then there's a bifurcation in that group where maybe an event happens like the hack, or maybe there's proposed changes that not everyone agrees with, and then that's led to, in part, why we have quite so many blockchains now. We have different camps and factions, and that speaks to there's this underlying tribalism in a lot of blockchain. But I think we can maybe park some of that discussion for another episode, and maybe we can just round off the history by talking about the third element of blockchains, or the third kind of category we see now, which is these private blockchains, right? So where did they come from?
Yeah, so the blockchains, I think the kind of the core original principle of blockchain was to be public, was to be, anyone could see, anyone could kind of contribute potentially to these blockchains. And then there was a move maybe in later years to have private versions of blockchains. And these are the key kind of technology there was the focus was around enterprise grade blockchain technology for sectors that wanted more control. They wanted things to be customizable. What they saw in the market, say, Bitcoin, Ethereum, maybe wasn't for them. And they kind of wanted control and maybe even more efficiency, which is something I guess we could speak about a bit later, as opposed to maybe the trust and openness that's provided with public blockchains.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I think, ironically, given that this private nature flies in the face of a lot of the early initial blockchains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others, that they were trying to achieve with this public nature and not having encrypted things and not being private. And then things like Hyperledger came around in, I think, 2016 was when Hyperledger started launching these kind of enterprise grade private blockchains. And actually, that was what gained, I would argue, most traction in with companies. So there was lots and lots of projects that took this idea. They could see the value in a shared distributed database that they could use for specific industries. So I think shipping was one of the examples where you have lots of different parties involved with shipping. There's lots of complexity, and instead of having an open public network where everyone can verify processes, they decided, actually, we can have a closed system here. We can have a closed network of just the stakeholders that this supply chain is relevant to, and then they would maintain a blockchain together. And there's lots of debate about the value of that, whether it even is a blockchain. But it's good to acknowledge that now we have that third dimension to things, that there is also private blockchains that are not used quite so much now, and people have kind of gone back to using public blockchains. I mean, arguably a bit like what happened with the internet. We talked last week about Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, and Web 1 was initially very distributed, but we had the .com bubble as well, right? When there were lots of intranets created and private internets, and obviously that concept didn't have the same value as a public internet, and then eventually everyone went back to public internet. So do you think that's a similar thing we could be seeing in blockchain as well?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes from a misconception that public blockchain means that all data that is kind of referenced on the blockchain is visible. If I use the blockchain in any way for my application, it means all the raw data that I'm using on that application goes in the blockchain. Everyone can see all of my personal identifying information, everything about me, my tax history, my salary. And that's not the case, as we will kind of go into, I think, in future episodes. You can just reference things on chain, and it's really difficult to create a link between the actual raw data and what's being referenced on the blockchain. So yeah, Jack, how does all of this relate to Web3?
That's a good question, because this is the Untangling Web3 podcast. So maybe I would say that the initial ideas and principles that are inherent to blockchain, this idea of removing unnecessary third parties, having more efficient, more peer-to-peer direct interactions, all of these are values that are common to blockchain, essentially. So they kind of coexisted and grown up together, this notion of Web3. Web3 kind of started to be talked about a little bit after Bitcoin and the early blockchain. So I think it's a natural evolution of blockchain. Web3 is just generalizing that notion to lots of different industries and aspects of the internet.
Yeah, I've seen some like nice diagrams, and it's a shame that we can only share audio on this, where it's like the central circle is crypto, and then the circle outside of that is blockchain, and the circle outside of that is Web3, and it kind of shows like the order of magnitude and what you need to kind of enable the other technologies. But yeah, I completely agree. I think blockchain is effectively the key technology in Web3, and to be a bit more applied, it enables decentralized and transparent ways to store and exchange information. And this obviously has all the kind of the effects of user control, user centricity, enabling peer-to-peer exchange without unnecessary third parties. So yeah, it's the key technology for Web3.
Yeah, I think I would go as far as to say, and it's an important qualifier. I think Web3 could, in theory, be implemented without a blockchain. There could be a way of doing it using other instruments, but blockchain appears to be by far the best platform, the best tool, the best infrastructure to deliver on those promises of Web3 to solve the problems that we were talking about in the last episode. So they're not necessarily they don't necessarily have to go hand in hand in the future, but right now they definitely do. They're definitely intrinsically married to each other, I think.
Yeah, and on that, I think that's a nice place to take a break.
Okay, so far we've talked about blockchain. We've given a kind of definition together of what we think blockchain is and how it relates to Web3, and also explored a little bit of the history of blockchain, and the industry that it spawned. So why don't we turn to our friend ChatGPT and see how its definition lines up with ours, maybe?
Oh, it gets a bit creepy when you start referring to ChatGPT as a friend. Yeah, so I've asked ChatGPT to explain this to my mom, because obviously she's the only listener right now. So ChatGPT said, "Hey mum, blockchain is a decentralized digital record book that securely and transparently keeps tracks of transactions. It stores information in connected blocks across multiple computers, making it difficult to tamper with. Primarily used for digital currencies like Bitcoin, blockchain also has a range of other potential applications." Not bad.
Not a bad definition. Yeah, I think we've covered a few of those points, right? We mentioned about it calls it a digital record book, which I think is what we're referring to as the ledger aspect. But yeah, I think that's a nice, easy way of understanding it.
Yeah, maybe we should go into some of these terms that have been kind of just dropped in there. Like a big one that we've obviously said many times and gets thrown around a lot in the space is decentralization.
Yeah, we've already been dropping it in ourselves, I've noticed, because it's so often spoken about in the same breath as Bitcoin and blockchain. So maybe I can have a stab at explaining decentralization. So a lot of people refer to this concept, decentralization, as there being many parties involved in this. So these networks that maintain the digital ledger itself, people would describe that network as decentralized if it has many parties that are involved. Now, in reality, decentralization is a spectrum. It goes from 1 to potentially infinity, right? It's either one party, which you'd call a totally centralized system, and that's what you have in a lot of existing Web2 architectures and systems. And you, at some point along that, you have to pick what your flavor of decentralization is. And I would say for something like Bitcoin, it's essentially a minimum number of parties you need for the network to maintain its properties, to maintain its immutability, to continue functioning, to be safe from subversion, right? So that could be anywhere from 3 to maybe 15 or something. And if you actually look historically, there's only ever around 4 to 6 of these nodes, these Bitcoin miners that are contributing blocks at any one time. So there's not actually that many people, not any entities involved, and the degree of decentralization, you might say, is not necessarily that high. But that's fine. The system still works nonetheless. So it depends where you fall on that spectrum. But I think it's important to know that for these systems to work, it doesn't necessarily have to be that high.
Yeah, and that's something that I've seen a lot in the space, that you think maybe that having 1,000 different parties validating things is preferable to 100, and maybe that's not always the case. It depends on how many trusted parties you actually have, how many trusted and kind of non-related parties you have validating the network. And I think something that I found a lot with this word is there's a lot of negative connotations with it. When we think of a decentralized network, it's not always like some people relate it to a decentralization of power, but it's more and more, I think, about decentralized network is about a robust and efficient system which removes any single points of failure. And there's kind of, having multiple nodes that have the entire history of a network and could kind of ensure that they're operating to the same standard, I think is more the purpose of the decentralized aspect of this.
And you'll get into a debate about trade-offs as well, right? So the more parties, the more nodes you have involved, then the more redundancy there is, the more irrelevant or unnecessary messages or communication between these computers. If you only had 3, that minimizes how much redundancy you'll have. But you also want to maximize for things like availability. So making sure that data will be available at some point in the network. So if I only have 3, maybe I'm worried that if all 3 of those go down at the same time, then I can't access the data on the ledger. But if I have 5 or 6, then that's much less of an issue. So it's a matter of trade-offs, and a lot of these things are, at the will of the markets. Essentially, you have these economic entities. A lot of the miners in Bitcoin are very large companies. So I think at least a few of them are publicly traded as well, or have been in the past. So it depends on what the incentives are for them, and how the network looks best from their perspective, depending on how many people they have. They don't necessarily want to connect to 100,000 different home users who might not be contributing very much to them, whereas just connecting to the other big players might be much more preferable.
Yeah. And I think the next term that I think we should go into, phrase, is this peer-to-peer, which obviously directly relates to decentralization. And I think a nice way to think of that is it's around direct exchange without unnecessary third parties. I think it's quite important to emphasize the unnecessary. I mean, most interactions, even in the Web3 model, there'll still be a point of trust to say, you are who you say you are, what you're saying is true, and all this kind of stuff. It's just that the removing of unnecessary third parties. There'll always be trusted intermediaries required for a lot of interactions. And I think maybe a good way to compare this is to cash. I think a good example is when I give you, like a £20 note, Jack. I don't know what I'm giving you a £20 note for, but that's a direct peer-to-peer interaction. And I think we don't really see that so much on the internet. It usually goes through these centralized gatekeepers that will kind of validate, verify, store, and exchange the information between you and I. Whereas maybe we'll see in the future, hopefully, more and more peer-to-peer data exchange that it replicates cash exchange, where I can just pass you a piece of data directly between me and you without needing unnecessary intermediaries.
So who are these intermediaries in the case of a cash payment then? Because when I hand over cash at a corner shop, then to me it looks just like I'm just paying the merchant, right? But maybe I'm using my my debit card instead to pay for something. Who are the intermediaries involved that are maybe unnecessary and things?
Yeah, exactly. So in a cash model, there's effectively security on the note. You expect there's been some due diligence that has created this note, which means it's very difficult for me to create a counterfeit note. So I think that kind of really directly relates to blockchain. Data that's stored on blockchain and potentially been verified using cryptographic proofs or something like this, like PKI, which we'll definitely go into in future episodes, to prove that the data is authentic. And that enables me to directly exchange that data with you. Whereas, say, in the case of your debit card, you do have the third party that's directly involved to validate that you can make that transaction, and there's efficiency trade-offs there. So I think the cash versus money is an interesting kind of paradigm that we will definitely talk about in future episodes.
And in both cases, it's probably important to mention that there are inefficiencies that exist that the kind of Bitcoin peer-to-peer model can improve on, right? So in the cash case, there's actually a quite high cost of storing and processing cash and validating, that it's not counterfeit. That's one of the problems. And then when you go to digital payments, like if I'm paying with my credit card, then you have this whole plethora of fees that come out of this, right? From your acquirer bank, your issuing bank, the bank who issues your card, the bank who accepts the payments on behalf of the merchant. There's fees for point of sale terminals. There's all sorts of extra costs that might be hidden to us users sometimes, but that will, potentially increase the cost of the product you're buying. So it's important to note that some of these can be addressed with blockchain. I want to move on to maybe another word that was used here, which was digital currency in the definition, because that opens up a whole new can of worms, right? Like, what are your thoughts on calling something like Bitcoin or Ethereum digital currency?
I mean, I know that, well, effectively Bitcoin is an peer-to-peer electronic cash system, right? So you're going to have problems with it being called a digital currency potentially.
Yeah, I think I don't personally like that phrasing. So this would be a negative point on ChatGPT here, is that currency implies a kind of sovereign state involved, or some backing by a state. Whereas obviously that's not the case for the kind of public permissionless blockchains that we talk about. But it does capture the fact that it's meant to work like money. So it's more like digital money than currency, I would say.
And that's quite an important distinction to make. And I wonder if you could start to involve some of the more speculative aspects of, some cryptocurrencies in that. When you kind of hear the term cryptocurrencies, a lot of people tend to think speculation rather than the utility that I guess more and more we're seeing the focus shifting towards. So another term that was used, I believe, in that definition was it was actually difficult to tamper with. I think the term that we've used in the previous episode and will probably use throughout will be immutability. And I think immutability is one of the core aspects of blockchain. And I mean, that specifically relates to two things in my mind. One, it's the decentralized nature, which we've spoken about, computers holding multiple copies of the same data so they can, reach consensus. And then that leads me nicely onto the second aspect, which is consensus. How do we actually ensure that these different versions of the same data is the same, and how do we add and append when we have 2-3+ versions of the same data? How do we make sure that as we're adding multiple transactions to that data set, that everyone has the same data? And that gets increasingly complicated when we think about the number of transactions that can potentially come through these networks. And again, I think we'll talk about it more in later episodes, but there are different consensus algorithms. There's different ways for these computers in the network to achieve consensus. I mean, the one that Bitcoin proposed was a proof of work consensus, where each node would do a large amount of work to actually kind of validate transactions into the network to prove there was some amount of effort done in that network. But more and more, we're seeing, say, networks like Ethereum shift from proof of work to proof of stake. And this has been an upgrade that has taken a long time and still hasn't been kind of fully adopted by everyone. And, that's not really battle tested. So it'll be very interesting to see what actually happens when this proof of stake consensus mechanism is adopted.
Yeah, I agree. I think you've kind of nailed it on the head there. Like, this immutability aspect is essentially about how difficult it is to change records once they're in the ledger. So we talked about what the ledger is and how it's maintained by this network of nodes, but not about how easy would it be for this network to create 2, 3, 4 different alternate versions of that network. And the proof of work algorithm you mentioned, that consensus mechanism, is kind of the OG mechanism that was used by Bitcoin and also Ethereum until recently, when it adopted proof of stake, which is a slightly different kind of less battle tested, as you said, version. So yeah, that's the kind of I would say the final element. You have these different blockchains. You have the fact that we also have private versus public, and now you also have the competing consensus mechanisms, and which will actually bear the most fruit in the future, which is really interesting.
I think this podcast has already been worth it just by the fact that you've said OG on here and it's recorded forever.
Yeah, it's a first for me. It's a first. There'll be consensus that was a mistake, I think.
Shall we move on to
I'll bring it back from that pause. That was rubbish. I was just reading the use cases that we said. Okay. So yeah, I think maybe I can go first with a use case that touches on the problems we talked about last week, which would be social media. So how can we improve social media with blockchain? Well, that would be to use this micropayments element. So using blockchains like Bitcoin to do very small payments. So why is this a compelling use case for me? Well, it basically changes the incentive model of something like a Twitter or a Facebook. So currently it's free to use. It's free at the point of use. So, or maybe I should say free to interact. So we can always view the data. You can see the data even if you haven't got an account logged in. But to interact, to post, to follow, to comment, to be involved in the conversation, it's completely free at the minute. And I think that is the source of a lot of the problems, like having trolls and bot farms, where there's no cost essentially associated with abusing the system. So how you would solve this with blockchain is to say, well, okay, instead of it being free, you apply a certain cost to liking, to commenting, subscribing, following. And that basically means that it's much, much harder, much more costly to abuse that. And you might still be able to see the data. I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people on Twitter who are just lurkers, right? So they're not actually posting necessarily all the time, but it would increase the cost of doing that and abusing that. And I think not only stopping those kind of problems, but it would also give you a way to earn as a user. So if I post something and it's a particularly funny meme or something, then I might get hundreds of likes out of that, which would then be a way I earn money directly without having to become, like we said, an influencer who's then an advertiser as well. So I can directly earn from people who follow me.
I'd be interested to see what you're posting that would get hundreds of likes, but I suppose that's TBD. Yeah, I actually, to relate this back to our first episode, I saw someone compare the kind of the Twitter lurkers to read only, like in kind of the first phase of the internet in Web 1. So they're in read only mode where they're not engaging, not really kind of contributing anything, and how they move to a Web 2 model. So it's quite interesting. I think one of my points around that would be, why would I, if you said to me, okay, I use Twitter right now, I don't really care about privacy too much. Maybe, I do have some bots that are interacting with me and I don't really like that. Why would I move to a model in which I would pay to engage and interact with people where I'm not paying anything right now?
Well, I mean, just for that fact, so I wouldn't mind having a bot reply to my tweets and comment on my tweets if they have to pay me, 5p to do that. Or another interesting thing you could do is have a social media where you can scale that. So for a given account, say I've identified someone I don't like or a bot account, I could toggle that they have to pay me £1 or £10 or £100 to comment on my tweets. So I wouldn't mind being trolled if I was getting paid that much for it. So I think there are lots of different ways you could take it, but it offers a different avenue, right?
Got you. So this is a way for you to monetize my engagement with you on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, all these things. You basically want to distance yourself from me, or at least charge me to engage with you.
Yeah, basically. You specifically.
So I think that's a great one. Obviously, everything related to social media is always good because it's very tangible. Everyone, there's what is it, 1.5 billion users of Facebook. Everyone kind of understands the value in having like an upgrade in social media. My use case is probably slightly less tangible for a lot of people, even though it affects the entire world, I'd say. So it's around supply chains, and I think it's really important because everything made that is more complex than like a stick needs some kind of supply chains. And I think that they're more complex than ever. They're multi-border, they're multi-company, they're multi-ecosystem, multi-everything basically. And I think quite importantly, consumers care more than ever as well. There's kind of more and more insight into supply chains, and particularly, quite dodgy supply chains, and consumers care that the product they're buying, has come from, say, a fair trade, or they want to know who is actually involved in the entire kind of supply chain itself. And I think one of the issues here is the trust in data. So imagine like a world where each actor in a supply chain for, say, the coffee that you have or the phone that you're buying has to submit some data to the blockchain. And, if we actually kind of combine this together, we get traceability. So I can actually, once I buy my item, even before I buy my item, I can trust the data in the blockchain hasn't been tampered with, and actually kind of understand in more detail what the various stages were for the item that I'm about to buy. And one of the issues around this is garbage in, garbage out, which I think is something that is used in the kind of the blockchain space quite heavily. Blockchain really just ensures that the data hasn't been edited or hasn't been kind of changed anyway. So if I submit some data that isn't correct, that data is still not going to be correct. Blockchain's not really going to fix that. But one of the aspects we can actually add to kind of improve that is around identity. And there's a lot of work going on around digital identity. And as soon as we start to combine that with the data that's being submitted on chain, we then get a degree of authenticity and probably even ability to verify that data as well. So yeah, for me, supply chains are a big one. I think it could also streamline processes, all this kind of stuff, and reduce fraud. We're talking a lot about emissions and how much emissions go into a supply chain, ensuring that they're compliant. There's no slave labor that's gone into it. And I think supply chains on blockchain is going to be a massive kind of area for improvement over the coming years.
Well, yeah, I have a question on this then, because I think this is where lots of the private blockchains, this is the use case they were targeting, when Hyperledger first came out. So how, we talked about the transparent nature of a public blockchain. So can you use public blockchain to deal with that? What if the information in the supply chain is sensitive? Is it compatible with that?
Yeah, I think so. We talked earlier about hashing, and I think that's quite important. If I say, let's give an example. I want to say that, I am a farmer and I farm, 10 bananas or something like that. And I want to put that at the blockchain. There's obviously various ports, exports that it needs to go through, customs, all these kind of things, and various actors in that supply chain. I don't necessarily need to put 10 bananas by Alec Burns on the blockchain as readable raw data. I can put it through something called a hashing algorithm, which basically kind of obfuscates it. And obfuscates is a fancy word for kind of muddles the data so that no one can understand what it is. Put that on the blockchain. And then later on, if someone wants to understand what that muddled, obfuscated data is, I can provably say that my 10 bananas by Alec Burns relates to that data and was submitted at that time. And that's one of the beautiful things about hashing algorithms, is that it's almost impossible. Well, I would basically say right now it's computationally impossible to kind of replicate that raw data and relate it to a hash on chain. And yeah, like I say, so the raw data doesn't need to go on chain. There's a way of referencing it or fingerprinting it on chain and then exchanging the raw data off chain. So I could then say, if you're buying bananas, Jack, and you want to prove that I am the person that made those bananas, I'd say, okay, this is the reference on chain. Doesn't mean anything to you. Now I'll give you the raw data that relates to that, and you can provably say that was the data that was put on chain effectively using the fingerprint.
So you're using the on chain record to check against something else in the real world.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. So it's kind of a bit like you have a private portion of the public blockchain. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think, we'll still need mechanisms for exchanging the raw data. But I think the blockchain kind of provides that indisputability aspect. And I think this is quite important, actually, is that in a lot of the applications we're seeing, blockchain is really the USP. And I think to make it tangible to users, there's still a lot of things that need to be built around it. So when we're talking about the Web3 versus Web2, a lot of the function. Okay.
All right. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's two pretty solid use cases, and we've been singing the praises of blockchain the whole time. So maybe it's worth quickly covering to finish off some of the concerns or the things you should think about when using a blockchain. Some of the considerations you have to make. So maybe we can go to, you mentioned CryptoKitties, right, earlier on. I know that caused a lot of problems when it first happened, right, because it was so popular. Maybe you can talk us through what happened actually.
Yeah, so this is a major pain point, and it kind of all revolves around scalability. And I know that this is a particular pain point for you, Jack, because you were, heavily involved in CryptoKitties. You're a big admirer of their work, and I think the popularity of CryptoKitties itself. I think there was 1.5 million users, active users at one stage, one of which was obviously you. And this resulted in a lot of transactions on the Ethereum, lots of spikes in transactions, and the fees were astronomical. It really upped massively, and the network basically couldn't keep up with the amount of demand. And I think I saw some like news headlines that was like CryptoKitties kills Ethereum, and there was lots of network down just trying to keep up with the demand. So yeah, this is a big issue for a lot of blockchains, is the scalability aspect. And there's kind of two mechanisms for solving this. One is like I guess layer one scaling solutions, and more we're seeing these kind of layer two scaling solutions that build on top of layer ones like Bitcoin and Ethereum.
What's layer one and layer two? Can you describe them? What the difference is?
Yeah, got you. So blockchains, quite generally, I would describe as layer one. So where the consensus is achieved, it's basically the kind of the foundational data storage solution. And then layer twos are built on top of that. So they, a good example was, if I kind of bundle my 10 CryptoKitties together on a layer two network, and I just send one reference for all of those 10 kitties to the layer one solution, there I have two layers that are effectively separated, and it reduces the kind of, I guess, the throughput on the layer one solution by creating this, or offsetting the data and the throughput onto the layer two.
Got it. Yeah, that's it. It's an interesting problem. So you're basically touching on the scalability aspect, right? Which I think, lots of people will talk about blockchains as not being scalable, because you've had a lot of examples in the past. I mean, that CryptoKitties event was the first thing that drew the public eye on the lack of scalability of some blockchains, and it's becoming a bigger problem as they become more popular. More people want to use them. There's more demand, and then now those bottlenecks of how many transactions they can process are coming to light. So yeah, scalability is definitely one of the biggest sticking points, and there's obviously lots of different approaches to solving that, which I think maybe we can expand on in an entire future episode, because it is a big topic.
Yeah, and I think one of the other considerations that I know you want to talk about is privacy.
Yeah, privacy, definitely. Privacy, so we've touched on it already a little bit, and right at the start of the episode, we were talking about this message inscribed in the Bitcoin block 0, right, which we said was in plain text. You could just see it, and I was saying you can see the motion of funds moving between one party and another. So that seems like a big privacy issue, and it can be, depending on how you use the blockchain. So there are lots of different ways you can use the blockchain, and you can use it in a bad way, like most technologies, most tools. You can use it poorly, and you can use it in ways that will not preserve your privacy, or you can build in identity systems, as you were mentioning. So, again, to go back to the Bitcoin example, what you can actually see on the blockchain is that something called a public key. And again, we'll define all these in the future, but the public key is something that Alec and I will both have. So you'll have a public key, I'll have a public key. When he sends me Bitcoin, he's essentially sending it from his public key to my public key. And that's what controls, what helps you control and authorize new transactions. So on the blockchain, we're not recording Alec and Jack, our identities. We're recording the public keys that the funds are moving between. And what we can do is we can build quite complex privacy features on top. So how do associating identity with one of those keys, but doing it in a private way, so that I can prove to Alec that this is my public key, but not necessarily revealing to the whole world that's my public key. And that kind of brings, we've seen a lot of examples of where, particularly on Ethereum, actually. So in Ethereum, they're not so much called public keys, but you'll call them addresses. So you'll see people saying, "Oh, give me some Ethereum, pay to my address," which is, for all intents and purposes, like a public key. And they'll just post an address, and then from that point, you can track exactly what happens to that address. So you can see all the motion of funds in and out. So once you've made that real world identity link, then you know what's going to happen with that person in the future. And a lot of people, so the example I would give is that in the past couple of years, with the NFT craze that was going on, you saw lots of influencers on social media who would start to promote certain projects, certain NFT tokens. And they would often do it in a way that looked innocent. They would be like, "Oh, I really like this NFT. This is a great project. Check this out." And what they wouldn't be saying is that they're actually taking payments to to promote these things, and they weren't disclosing this. So this is something you have to do when you're doing a paid promotion, is you have to disclose it. You might have seen that on YouTube or something. Whenever someone advertises, they say this includes paid promotion. Now, lots of these influencers didn't include this disclosure, but they were then caught out later. So there's a really good channel I would recommend if you don't watch it, Alec, called called CoffeeZilla, who kind of documents a lot of these happening, right? I don't know if you've seen that, but he basically exposed or shown people exposing these influencers because they'll maybe post an address one time, and then you can track the funds coming in to their address over time. So then you can match it up. You can work out they might have accepted a payment from the owner of an NFT project 1 hour before they started promoting it out of nowhere. So, you can sacrifice your privacy if you use it incorrectly, I think, is the main point. But the good message is there's lots of different ways you can improve your privacy when you use blockchain.
Yeah, what were some of the high-profile cases? Who were some of the celebrities that were getting done for these NFT schemes?
I think Emma's saying Kim Kardashian was one of them. I don't want to name any in particular, but I can remember there being some pretty high-profile ones. I think maybe you can go and watch CoffeeZilla's channel, and he will give you the whole lowdown. But there are some pretty big names out there. Some people who like to fight in amateur boxing matches and things like that, let's say.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I think, an important point that you raised there around, pseudo-anonymity rather than anonymity, that you can potentially link these addresses to people. And I think this is something that I really do want to talk about in future episodes, is around Ponzi schemes and kind of assets that have been stolen, and how governments and kind of law enforcement agencies can actually track these addresses, and how, even though there's kind of the hackers have created these ways to obfuscate funds and assets by, sending them between millions of transactions over the course of millions of addresses, very quickly, that there are quite impressive ways of tracking assets through all of these different addresses. And then eventually, when someone tries to redeem those assets by, convert it to an exchange and back into normal currency that they can use, they then, come down on them quite swiftly. And there's a lot of interesting examples of this that I think we should go into in future episodes.
Yeah. Maybe I would just finally close on one other concern, is that because blockchains are essentially giving users more options for how they, we're talking about monetary instruments effectively, so something that can be used like digital cash or a bit like money. So how you handle that money, what security measures you take as an individual, is also really important. So how if you've ever downloaded a wallet, you'll have been a wallet that lets you use a blockchain, then you'll have been prompted, no doubt, to write down a 12-word phrase as your security, and that scares a lot of people. And it's important because your personal security of your funds is actually it can really go wrong. There's the famous case of someone from Newport, so someone else from Wales, not just me, but in the blockchain landscape, but who accidentally threw out a hard drive that contained the security passwords effectively. So the keys behind his wallet, threw out on a hard drive which contained 7,500 Bitcoins on it. So, and I think he's had an ongoing struggle to work with the local authorities to try and get it back, which is, it's a good story, but it's something you feel really sorry for him for. And it's a reminder to take care when you're using blockchains. And again, lots of this will be mitigated over time because it's a maturing industry. The tools to help with these things, how you can recover funds, how you can insure funds. There are insurance products now for blockchain wallets and things. So it's getting better, but it's also worth knowing that there are risks involved when you're getting involved for the first time.
Yeah, I find these stories so interesting. When someone, I think that guy from Newport specifically, he thinks it's in some kind of landfill somewhere, right? And he's like hired multiple agencies, like some of the people that try to find like crashed airplanes and things like this, to help him find this hard disk in this landfill, and offered them like 70% of the reward. There was like another one where I think he had like 5 attempts to guess his seed phrase, which is like I guess like what Jack said, the private keys for that. And he's on like his last attempt, and it's like, if someone can help me solve this, I'll give them 90% of all the monies that are on there.
The irony is the guy in Newport is like I think he's put together a really interesting plan to salvage it that involves automatically searching through things using AI and robots to sift through and look for what might be the hard drive and things. So yeah, it's a great story, but it's very sad at the same time.
All the buzzwords in one project: robotics, AI, ML to find cryptocurrencies on hard disks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think another interesting fact that Emma's just dropped into the chat that I think is quite a good one is that the first payment that Bitcoin was actually used for was for 2 pizzas. And Jack, can you guess how much that was paid for those 2 pizzas back in 2010?
2 pizzas. Was it in America? I think so. Let's say $30 or something like that.
$30, where it was 10,000 Bitcoins, which at the time was worth around $41. So your guessing of pizza prices is pretty on point. And now that is worth some tens of millions of dollars. So I have no idea if that pizza joint held on to those Bitcoins. Probably not, but it's quite an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, I just want to know what the toppings were to be worth that much, gold foil or something.
The fanciest. I think it actually went down as the most expensive pizza that was ever created.
You'd hope so, I don't know what would beat that. So I think we've covered a lot of things there. We've discussed what blockchain is, and we've discussed the history of blockchain, some of the different flavors, private, public, some of the different aspects like the consensus mechanism, proof of work, proof of stake. We covered a couple of use cases, which I think are really interesting, and it's fair to say only a couple of, we're only scratching the surface of the many applications there are of blockchain, but we discussed 2 ones that are particularly compelling to us. And we've also covered a couple of the things to be wary of, or the considerations for the industry itself. So I don't know what you think, Alec, that seems like a good, sensible place to wrap up for this episode.
Yeah, I'm hoping that it's explained, the concept of blockchain to a lot of people, especially my mom. But I think as we did before, maybe we've opened up even more future episodes to explain a lot of the concepts that we've introduced and barely scratched the surface of. So yeah, here's to the next episode, I guess. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.